This is a serious adversary. Why could U.S. strikes against the Houthis in Yemen start another war in the Middle East? The U.S. and Britain hit Houthi targets in Yemen with Tomahawk missiles. On the night of January 12, the United States and Great Britain launched a massive attack on Houthi targets in Yemen. The attacks were carried out using Tomahawk missiles from warships, submarines, and fighter aircraft. Prime Minister of the United Kingdom Rishi Sunak clarified that non-combat support was provided by the Netherlands, Canada, and Bahrain, and U.S. President Joe Biden, in turn, explained that the strike on Yemen was defensive in nature. The Houthis promised to respond to the missile attacks and set fire to the entire Middle East region. Lenta Ru looked into the history of the Houthi movement and the prospects for a new large-scale war in the Middle East. Guerrillas of Allah. The history of the Houthi movement began in the 1990s. Its main base is the Zaidi, a branch of Shurazm-populated Sada province on the border with Saudi Arabia. The founder of the movement, Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, advocated a return to the roots, to the time when Islam was not yet divided into different teachings and schools, and the unification of all Muslims based on the Quran, in which he drew not only religious and moral, but also socio-economic attitudes. He called his movement Ansar Allah, that is, partisans of Allah. Despite their desire to return to the roots of Islam, the Houthis can hardly be called a fundamentalist movement. On the contrary, they have always called the fundamentalist schools of Salafism and Wahhabism, widespread in neighboring Saudi Arabia, a threat to Yemeni identity. Rather, the Houthis advocate reforming Islam so that it can remain a relevant idea to protect Islamic societies from Western influence. Surprisingly, the Houthi movement positions itself simultaneously as a native Yemeni movement, standing up for the defense of the identity and interests of Yemenis from alien cultural influences, and as a pan-Islamic ideology of a reformist anti-imperialist type. As political scientist and expert of the Russian International Affairs Council RIAC Kirill Semenov emphasized in a conversation with Lenta Ru, what distinguishes the Houthis from other Islamic movements is that this is a Zaidi movement and it is one of a kind. The Houthis profess a separate, independent branch of Islam, which now exists only in Yemen. This is certainly Shia Islam, but it is not as close to the rest of Shurazm as is often believed. It is very independent and very different from Shurazm. For example, in Iran, he explained, in the entire Middle Eastern mosaic of Islamic movements and groups, the Houthis are a purely Yemeni story. In their foreign policy ideology, the Houthis take radical anti-Western positions, using the slogan, "Death to the USA, Death to Israel, Curse on the Jews, Victory to Islam." At the same time, their official representatives emphasize that the movement does not advocate the literal destruction of the United States and Israel, but only the removal of their governments pursuing an imperialist policy towards the Islamic world. The Houthis consider their movement to be part of an Iranian-led axis of resistance against Israel, the United States and the entire West, along with Hamas and Hezbollah. 1-2. However, political scientist Kirill Semenov warned against considering the Houthis a proxy force acting in the interests of Iran. Zaydis are still very different from Iranian Shiites. Of course, they have common ground, common moral guidelines especially regarding Israel and the United States, he says. The expert emphasized that the Houthi movement was not created by emissaries of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC). It appeared in Yemen absolutely independently, and they found an ally in Iran, because there was simply no one else to rely on, says Kirill Semenov. The Houthis are not Iranian proxies, they are Iran's allies and partners. In 2004, the Houthis actually launched an uprising against the Yemeni government. They accused the country's President Ali Abdullah Saleh of corruption and ties to the United States. The war continued for 6 years and turned the northern provinces of Yemen, with a Shiite population, into a zone of humanitarian disaster. The government failed to defeat the Houthis, and the fighting ended with a ceasefire agreement. True, the following year Yemen was captured by the events of the Arab Spring. The Houthis have taken advantage of the unrest to expand their influence and renew their armed struggle against government forces and rival factions. By 2014, the country had resumed full-scale civil war. Iran began to provide support to Ansar Allah. By 2015, the Houthis and the groups supporting them carried out a military coup in Yemen. The de facto government of the country was the Revolutionary Committee under the leadership of Muhammad Ali al-Houthi, the brother of the founder of the movement, Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, who died in a clash with government forces back in 2004. In the Ring of Fronts, Saudi Arabia reacted very sharply to the Houthis coming to power. The monarchy did not need a source of instability on its borders, and intellectually it disagreed quite seriously with the Houthis, They did not accept Wahhabi Islam and considered all Muslim governments that entered into an alliance with the United States to be traitors. Powered by Dubverse. On April 25, Storm of Determination transitioned into a new operation, called Operation Restore Hope. Its goal was declared to be a targeted fight against the Houthi movement. Airstrikes continued on Houthi military bases and positions, and leaflets were dropped on cities and provinces calling on local residents to join the fight against the rebels. The intervention galvanized the anti-Houthi opposition in Yemen itself. The country's former president Abdirabba Mansour Hadi, overthrown by the Houthis, returned to the country and announced the start of an armed struggle against them. The country again plunged into the chaos of civil war, and the bombing by the Arab coalition continued. A humanitarian disaster has begun again in Yemen, this time affecting the entire country. The UN intervened in the conflict, which proposed a roadmap for overcoming the crisis. It envisaged the abolition of the Houthi constitution and the creation of a transitional government, but due to insurmountable differences between the parties to the conflict, its implementation was never started. Over time, the intensity of fighting in Yemen has decreased, but the fighting has not stopped completely. Coalition forces bombed Houthi positions, and they responded with terrorist attacks against supporters of the old government. This war was even called the worst humanitarian disaster of our time. At the same time, the Houthis' political positions have only strengthened. They showed the possibility of imposing serious resistance against a large international coalition with modern weapons, supported by the United States. According to RIAC expert and political scientist Kirill Semenov, the Arab coalition forces failed to break the rebels because the Houthis enjoyed enormous support in the northern regions of Yemen, populated mainly by Zaydis. In addition, their forces were quite combat-ready and received regular support from Iran. They had serious preparation and focus on results. Plus, the most combat-ready units of the Yemeni army went over to their side, he said in a conversation with Lenta Ru. The Houthis had significant human resources to mobilize and significant experience. All this made the Houthis a very serious adversary. Bad peace and good war. At the beginning of 2021, the new U.S. President Joe Biden announced the end of support for the offensive operations of the Arab coalition forces in Yemen and the beginning of the search for peaceful ways to resolve the conflict. The U.S. even removed the Houthis from the list of terrorist organizations, which gave their government access to humanitarian aid. They warmly welcomed such a step and reduced the intensity of their rhetoric. It seemed that long-suffering Yemen had a chance for peace. In 2022, the warring parties, with the assistance of the UN, agreed on a temporary truce, which was extended every 2 months. During this time, it was possible to exchange prisoners, launch programs to help children, and supply the country with necessary humanitarian goods. Throughout 2023, international observers were confident that the civil war in Yemen was about to end. The conflict between Israel and Hamas changed everything. The Houthis unconditionally supported the Gaza Strip. After the Israeli strikes began, Ansar Allah led people into mass demonstrations. Protesters held Palestinian flags in their hands and shouted slogans in support of the residents of Gaza. The organization officially declared its readiness to send fighters to Gaza, accused the United States of sponsoring its Zionist entity, and soon began launching missile attacks on Israeli territory. On November 14, the group announced that it would attack all ships in any way associated with Israel and would not allow them to pass through the waters of the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Houthis called their actions a response to American-Israeli aggression in the Gaza Strip. In early December, the group has threatened to attack all ships heading to Israel, regardless of who owns them. Since then, several commercial and military vessels in the Red Sea have come under attack. One of the most high-profile cases was the seizure of the Galaxy Leader cargo ship with an international crew on November 19. The Houthis towed it to the Yemeni coast and said they would not discuss terms for the crew's release until Israel stopped fighting in the Gaza Strip. Because of this, 4 of the world's largest shipping companies have suspended the passage of ships through the Suez Canal or sent them to other routes. Statements about this were released by the Swiss shipping company Mediterranean Shipping Company MSC, the French CMA CGM, the Danish shipping giant Maersk, and the German transport company Hapag-Lloyd. Collectively, they account for almost 54% of container traffic worldwide. In response, the United States announced the creation of the broadest possible maritime coalition to protect shipping in the Red Sea. Ships from the US, British, and French navies headed to the region. On January 10, the Houthis attacked U.S. and British warships escorting civilian ships with missiles and drones. The military had to use aviation. In response, the UN Security Council approved a resolution demanding that the Houthis stop attacks on commercial ships. The U.S. and allies have a legitimate reason to strike Yemen. On the night of January 12, U.S. and British forces launched a massive attack on Houthi targets in Yemen. U.S. Air Force's Middle East Command said the military carried out more than 60 strikes on 16 targets in Yemen, including command posts, ammunition depots, launch sites, manufacturing facilities, and air defense radars. The Air Force used more than 100 precision-guided munitions of various types. Political scientist and RIAC expert Alexei Naumov believes that with the help of this operation, the United States is trying to achieve several goals at once. Firstly, the United States needs unhindered operation of the transport artery in the Red Sea. The second goal is to maintain its own hegemony, the role of the world policeman. From the U.S. point of view, any maintenance of world order must fall on American shoulders. Alexei Naumov, political scientist, RIAC expert. Alexei Naumov also believes that the United States is trying to solve the problem of intimidating the Muslim world against the backdrop of the conflict in the Gaza Strip. This is also intimidation of Iran and its allies, who are ready to open a second front against Israel. However, the expert is confident that it will not be possible to completely neutralize the Houthis without a full-fledged ground operation. We remember how Saudi Arabia tried to do this, and what came out of it, Alexei Naumov is sure. Political scientist Kirill Semenov agrees with him. We don't know how sensitive these strikes are for the Houthis. Perhaps they are like grain to an elephant. They were bombed by the Saudi coalition for 7 years. According to Alexei Naumov, periodic attacks by the Houthis on ships in the Red Sea will continue. But Kirill Semenov is confident that it is too early to say that a full-fledged regional war could begin in the Middle East. He mentioned that the Houthis have made peace with Saudi Arabia and do not yet intend to resume hostilities. And Saudi Arabia also does not intend to resume hostilities against the Houthis and is ready to bring the peace process to an end. The conflict with the United States is a completely different war, a different front of their struggle. It is connected with the barbaric actions of the Israelis in Gaza, and the dynamics will depend only on Israel's actions in Gaza. The Houthis do not set themselves the goal of blocking shipping, they only attack associated ships with Israel.